Hello and welcome everyone to this video interview, which is part of our series Conversation with Experts. For each episode, we invite a prominent expert to discuss a specific topic with one of the ECMI researchers. My name is Felix Schulte. I'm a senior researcher at the European Center for Minority Issues and head of the Conflict and Security Cluster at the ECMI. I'm delighted that today I can talk with Dr. Walsh about the topic of territorial autonomy as a tool to regulate interstate conflicts. Dawn Walsh is an assistant professor in the School of Politics and International Relations, and she's the director of the Institute for British-Irish Studies at the University College in Dublin. She was previously an Irish Research Council Marie Curie Elevate postdoctoral fellow, and she also previously held an Irish Research Council postgraduate fellowship. In her research, Dawn focuses on conflict resolution in divided societies, especially on institutional designs and the role played by international actors, mediation of ethno-national conflict, the implementation of peace agreements, and the stability of conflict management institutions, so relevant expert to talk about this topic, territorial autonomy and conflict regulation. Other research interests include gender and politics, as well as the Northern Ireland question, the peace process there, and the broader Anglo-Irish relations. So she has published several books on these topics, as well as many research articles in well-known journals such as Conflict Management, Peace Science, Ethnopolitics, Regional Federal Studies, among others. So I'm very happy to welcome you today, Dawn.
Thanks, Felix.
So our topic today is territorial autonomy and conflict regulation. So territorial autonomy, our sharing provisions have been included in many peace agreements intended to end interstate violent conflicts. We think of Northern Ireland, think of Bosnia, Sudan, and many other cases. Also in many peace processes, such provisions are discussed as a solution to end violence. So this is a topical and important issue to talk. The very big question, master questions, academics as well as practitioners asks are, of course, so why do some autonomy agreements fail while others survive? How can we explain this? How can we improve such agreements? How can we avoid negative consequences, negative side effects, etc.? Of course, we will not solve these questions now in a 30-minute online talk. But what we can do and want to do today is to discuss on some relevant issue, and our focus will be in particular on two factors, conditions, success factors. You investigated more closely in your research, Dawn, and this is the role of guarantees as well as the role of independent commissions. So how do these institutions work? How can these institutions help to increase the chances of durable peace in post-conflict societies? But first, I want to start with a more personal question that I'm sure many of our listeners and viewers will find very interesting. And the question is, so what motivates you to investigate autonomy arrangements? So how did you get interested in these kinds of post-conflict institutions, Dawn?
Sure, Felix. So you might be able to tell by my accent that I'm not only based in Dublin, but I'm Irish. So growing up in Ireland in the 1990s, the negotiations in Northern Ireland were really part of the political backdrop. So they were constantly on the news, and they were something that as a teenager that I was aware of. And I was particularly intrigued as to how these negotiations were coming up with kind of creative institutional solutions to a conflict that I guess I had grown up with and my parents had grown up with thinking was zero-sum and intractable. So it was always at the back of my mind. And then I went on to study politics at university, and then particularly in my graduate studies, I started to read some of the work of John McGarry and Brendan O'Leary, and to look at consociationism, and particularly at the power sharing and autonomy arrangements in consociationism. So, as well as doing that reading at the same time, the 1998 peace agreement was being implemented. It was, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, suffering from some difficulties. But I was really interested in how creative institutional design can incentivize and motivate people to move from conflictual relationships to cooperative relationships. And I guess, particularly as a teenager and in my 20s, I was really optimistic about how these institutions could really lead to much more friendly relations across the British Isles.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. I mean, we will come back to the case of Northern Ireland in a second. But I mean, we see that many cases of these autonomy arrangements must be regarded as failures. So Jammu and Kashmir, which has not no special status anymore, Gilgit-Baltistan, Kurdistan, many other historical regions also, of course. So it's very obvious that autonomy does not work everywhere and under all circumstances. And of course, there are many critical voices and scholars who argue that autonomy solutions kind of foster separatist tendencies, they empower former rebels, they lead to instability, they lead to secessionist conflicts, etc., etc. So from your also personal but also academic perspective, so what makes autonomy a useful tool, and under what conditions should autonomy arrangements be implemented?
Okay, so the first thing I'd say is I think sometimes we're a little bit hard on autonomy when we judge it. So it's often adopted in some of the most protracted conflicts and in situations where they are inherently unstable. So I'm not sure how much of this can always just be attributed to choosing an autonomy arrangement. The other thing to note, I would say, is that institutional design in general can be used to motivate or incentivize certain behaviors, but when actors have, malicious intent or act in bad faith, institutional design isn't able to do anything in those situations. It simply creates incentives. So thinking about autonomies in particular, what I would say is that they're compromises. So typically what we have are, geographically concentrated minorities who often want a high degree of autonomy or even independence or to join with a kin state. And we have a central government that wants to maintain as much power as humanly possible. In those contexts, autonomies are the only compromise that's often acceptable to both sides. And that's what I think makes them useful, is they are sometimes something that both sides can accept. But because they're an unhappy compromise, there is, of course, instability. And I think that particularly in these contexts, there's often a lack of trust when you're coming out of interstate conflict. And there's histories often of atrocities. And this means that both sides can be fearful, as you said, that the other will use the autonomy arrangements. Particularly, we see these arguments that, minorities use them to push for secession, and they're not unfounded. Arguments, we've seen this in Iraqi Kurdistan, for example. But what I'd say is the reason that I think they're important is they're often the only arrangement that is acceptable to both parties. And therefore, I think as academics, our job is to try and see how they can be best designed to provide some degree of stability or ameliorate the situation. And this is really context specific. And I think that's something that people have to remember in terms of the relative power, demographics, history. These will all come into play in terms of how well autonomies perform.
Thank you. Very, very interested. So things to highlight. So often the only compromise, so we don't have too many options in many circumstances, in many conflict settings. But of course, then also what you said, what are our expectations on the one hand, and of course, if people, former rebels, other actors don't want peace, it's of course hard to achieve, but then of course not the institutional framework can be blamed for this. So you already mentioned it. So how can these arrangements be designed? How can we make them a bit more stable? I found it very interesting in your book published in 2018. You focus on guarantee mechanisms. So we'll put a link into the descriptions below that everyone interested can find it and read it, which is of course highly recommended. So in this book, you state that guarantees are key to make territorial self-governance, post-conflict autonomy arrangements work and to overcome this challenge of instability and between these different demands for territorial integrity on the one hand and empowerment, self-determination on the other. So what exactly are these guarantees and what makes such guarantee mechanisms work?
Okay, so a guarantee that an arrangement, a law, or a policy, and it seeks to ensure that the autonomy arrangements as agreed are not unilaterally changed. So some form of change over time is quite typical in political institutions, whether in post-conflict societies or anywhere else, and that's fine. But what we want to give parties comfort that this won't happen unilaterally and any future changes will be negotiated. So you can have guarantees at both the domestic and the international level. And as you say, I kind of set this out and applied to a number of cases in the book. So at a domestic level, guarantees take the form of legislation. And this can either be ordinary domestic legislation, special legislation, or constitutionalizing the autonomy arrangements. And of course, each of these different types of legislation offer a different strength of guarantee to the autonomy. So ordinary domestic laws, typically fairly easy to change if a party or a coalition has a majority in parliament. And so that offers kind of the weakest guarantee of autonomy arrangements. Then you can have special legislation that requires, for example, supermajorities or concurrent majorities between, for example, central parliament and the regional assembly in order to alter the arrangements. And then kind of usually at the highest level of domestic guarantee, you have incorporating the autonomy arrangement into a constitution. So constitutions are typically harder to change than any other form of law in a country. Now, one of the kind of weaknesses of these domestic guarantees is that typically if one side is to essentially unilaterally change that autonomy, in order for this guarantee to work, you often have to have redress to the courts. And this can be a problem in post-conflict contexts on a number of different levels. So often, for example, the rule of law is quite weak. Courts have low capacity. But even if these are not the cases, you want to be careful that you don't essentially politicize the judiciary and force them to be seen to be taking sides in an internal ethno-national conflict. And here, one of the things that I think is useful, and Stefan Wolf has talked about this, is arbitration committees. So rather than recourse to the ordinary court system, you can have particular arbitration committees. So domestic guarantees can be helpful, and they have the added legitimacy of being part of that domestic institutional framework within a country, but they're definitely not perfect, and in many cases, they can be quite weak. So I think that international guarantees are also important. And here I make another distinction, and that's between hard international guarantees. So this is things like troops on the ground who are going to literally use military force to ensure that the autonomy arrangements as agreed, while also maybe doing other things, are upheld by both sides, or, for example, direct international governance. Now, these kind of hard guarantees require really high levels of direct intervention by an international actor or an international organization into a peace process country or region. And this raises questions as to whether there's the political will to do this on behalf of the international communities or members of it. And also it raises questions of legitimacy, particularly in the medium to long term. And often these guarantees do need to be provided in the medium to long term, not just the short term. So there's that kind of question around hard international guarantees. And then the final kind of guarantee I look at are soft international guarantees. And this is, for example, aid or trade policy conditionality. So you tell a local party or actor that if they don't uphold their side of the autonomy arrangements, or if they try to change them without negotiation and agreement, that you'll, for example, withdraw aid, or you won't enter into certain trade partnerships. And this requires obviously a lot less intervention. In some ways, it could be seen as more legitimate, even though it could still be seen by some as manipulative. But it can be effective. The only problem here is it tends to be quite time limited. So if you've given aid or you've had a trade relationship and that carrot is now gone, you can't use that in 10 years' time. The aid has already been transferred. So combinations of these guarantees tend to be seen in different peace agreements and that have autonomy arrangements, and different combinations in different contexts, as you'll see in the book, raise different challenges, or can be good at stabilizing arrangements.
Thank you. Yeah, so very, very interesting. Also, the kind of normative consequences and other consequences. So we the domestic level and also an international level, perhaps not as a sufficient condition, but in some cases with a positive effect. You describe in the book. I think it's interesting to take a closer look at the specific case that I believe that many viewers are familiar with, and so Northern Ireland and the peace process there, and you are a Northern Ireland expert. So my question would be, so are there such guarantee mechanisms included in the 1998 peace agreement, so the Good Friday peace agreement? How are they designed, and would you say that there are really enough to guarantee long-term peace in the region?
Apologies, we have thunder and lightning, and my dogs are not absolutely delighted by it. So what I would say in Northern Ireland is that we do have different guarantee mechanisms. Particularly, we have some domestic guarantees, and these are quite unique. And they relate to the specific context. So first of all, we do see that the peace agreement, including the autonomy arrangements, is guaranteed in ordinary British legislation. Mm-hmm. So there's the Northern Ireland Act 1998 that sets out, for example, the powers of the Assembly and Stormont. And because of the very particular British context where we have parliamentary sovereignty, and we've all seen how that's operated in the last number of years around Brexit, and we don't have a codified constitution, it's not really possible within the British context to offer a special legislative or a constitutional guarantee for the autonomy arrangements. Now, some courts at times have said the 1998 agreement is kind of a de facto constitution for the region, but as it requires a simple majority at Westminster to change, I don't think it is in the same way as, for example, a constitution might be. Now, what we do see also, though, in Northern Ireland, is we see a constitutional guarantee provided by the Irish government, which is quite unique. So the Irish government is a very different constitutional structure. So in Ireland, it requires a popular referendum to change the constitution. So that's kind of a very high bar. Mm-hmm. And as part of the 1998 agreement, there was a referendum in the Republic of Ireland to change Articles 2 and 3 of the Constitution. So they essentially had previously claimed kind of territorial authority over Northern Ireland, and had kind of been suspended, but that legitimately the country was the island as a whole. And those were changed to recognise the principle of consent. And what I would say is that these two kind of domestic guarantees are important, particularly for the unionist community and some members of the unionist community in Northern Ireland, because they gave kind of security or some sort of assurance that autonomy in Northern Ireland wasn't going to be used as a stepping stone towards a united Ireland without their consent. Because particularly the previous Articles 2 and 3 of the Irish Constitution were a source of kind of sensitivity and obviously fear for the unionist community. On the international side, what we saw in the 1998 agreement is that that agreement is essentially an international treaty between the British and Irish government. So what we could see is that if one side were to unilaterally change the autonomy arrangements, that the other would have recourse to international courts and institutions. And that's quite interesting. However, what we've seen is a real reluctance for that to be kind of enacted. So particularly we see, for example, in February 2000, the British government suspends the autonomy arrangements in Northern Ireland, and the Irish government does not support this course of action. Now, it's not done because the British government has some sort of centralizing tendency. It's done because the arrangements are incredibly unstable. The then unionist leader, David Trimble, is under pressure from his own kind of hardliners within his own party not to continue to share power with Sinn Féin in the absence of full IRA decommissioning. So the British government's suspension of the institutions is to try and give him space to allow some IRA disarmament to happen so that the institutions would be more stable. But this isn't, and the Irish government came out publicly and said this is not what they thought was the best step. But they did not use the fact that that treaty was now being breached, essentially, and to try and prevent this or to get the institutions back up and running. Instead, they decided to work with the British government to try and encourage the IRA to decommission so that it would be easier for unionists to re-enter the institution. So we see a guarantee mechanism there that's not used, which is, I think, very interesting.
That's super interesting. Thanks so much for these insights. Another focus, like not only guarantees, but another focus of your research is on independent commissions. So from my perspective, the role of such independent commissions is a rather unexplored topic, I would say, so compared to the role of other third parties, international organizations, for instance, where we know quite much about, I would say. So could you please elaborate a bit more on that? What are independent commissions? How do they work? How could they improve such processes?
Yeah, so again, my interest in these went back to kind of my interest in the Northern Ireland situations. It's actually my doctoral research was the first time I looked at these, now quite some time ago. And it was something that I was aware was being used in Northern Ireland to try and navigate some of the more contentious issues in the post-agreement stage of the peace process. So things like police reform, disarmament, and that there were these independent commissions built into the agreement to manage these issues. So interested, and like you, I couldn't see anybody else who had looked at them as a political or a peace institution. And so interestingly, I went back and drew on some other literatures, such as on non-majoritarian institutions. So these are things like central banks and human rights commissions in other contexts. And so I kind of came up with this definition of these institutions as having specialized public authority, but they're neither directly elected nor directly managed by elected officials. So this makes them different from kind of normal civil service departments. And you see a whole host of them. So you see them involved in things like elections, human rights, DDR, and they carry out very important post-conflict tasks, but they really haven't been studied to any great degree. And so I'm engaged in a project at the moment, which is looking at who gets to be on these commissions, how do they make decisions, what mandates are they given? So do they make recommendations or do they arbitrate? What policy areas do they work on? And all kind of really with the overarching question of if and when they can help to build peace.
Yeah, maybe a very, very tricky question, but do you have any recommendations for practitioners when it comes to guarantees or independent commission?
Yeah, so in terms of guarantees, what I would say is they have to be context specific. So they need to be aware of the political and historical context that they're working in, including things, for example, like the relative power difference between the different parties. So, for example, there's no point in telling everybody that they need a constitutional guarantee, because as we saw in the UK, that wouldn't mean very much. Similarly, in, for example, the Moldovan case with the autonomy in Gagauzia, we have a super majority required to change that, but the Gagauz are such a small minority that this means it can still be changed without their consent. So it's not actually a very effective guarantee. So we need to be aware of the context, and particularly when designing the domestic guarantees. And in terms of the international guarantees, what I would say is be prepared to be in it for the long run. And so we'll see, for example, in Northern Ireland, Brexit has contributed to a kind of new round of crises almost 25 years after the agreement. So the international community needs to recognise that the guarantees that they provide and the need to stabilize these arrangements isn't a 1 year, it's not even a 5-year job. We're talking about decades, and particularly to be ready to step back in if an unforeseen crisis or political development means that the situation becomes unstable again. In terms of commissions, what I would say is think about who you're putting on these commissions, design them deliberately, but also that while they can be good tools to overcome contentious issues, that because they're unelected and quite independent, their use raises questions around legitimacy and accountability. So we need, and I think in the coming years, one of the things my research will look at is why or how are their decisions and actions seen as legitimate?
Thank you very much. Also the kind of small outlook for the research on these institutions. I think that's also interesting for our more academic audience. Thank you very much, Dawn, for this very inspiring interview. I think that was very, very interesting, these insights of Northern Ireland. You are an expert in. Thank you all for listening, for your time and your interest in our online interview series. So if you are interested in this topic and related questions on power sharing, territorial autonomy, other interesting topics on ethnic conflicts and minority issues in general, I recommend not only the work by Dawn Walsh, her books and articles. I also warmly invite you to visit our website, ecmi.de, our social media challenge, where you can find much in our projects and work. So this is it, episode. Thanks again, Dawn, for this interview. Stay tuned for our next episode, and until then, goodbye.